right,
Okay,
there we go. I got it.
let me put that on there. Okay, good. Here we are.
How you doing, Dr. G? Dr. Goodwin?
Doing good.
Good. What are we talking about today?
Beowulf, the man, the myth, the legend, literally.
I love it.
Well, maybe he didn't exist, but who cares? It's as if he did, so that's all we need to know.
Yes.
So, yeah, so we talked earlier about diving into Beowulf and the symbolism and the Jungian analysis and all that stuff. So, having written a book on the subject, I thought I might be able to offer a wee bit of insight. So, the book, I wanted to start off, like we were talking about earlier, with why Beowulf? Like, why should we care about that particular piece of information? We talk about movies and all that kind of thing, and that, you know, that kind of makes sense because some of them are extremely popular and widespread. They're all over the world, you know, like the Avengers and Snyder Cut and all that kind of thing. So why should we talk about a poem that was written in the 9th century? Seems like a fair question. Now, of course, Jungians will typically say, well, it's myth, and you know, anything like that, doesn't matter how old it is, because it's all part of the collective unconscious. That makes sense. But there's even more reasons, I think, to look, and it's always a good idea to look at a particular text in its context and understand it at that level, because if they're correct and it is an expression of collective archetypal themes and elements, which it is, then the context in which it was written will only add to that. It'll tell us even more about it, rather than, sometimes I feel like that sometimes people will look at texts and treat them as if they're just sort of floating in the void and they have this independent meaning, you know, and that's not exactly what we're really trying to do. So Beowulf, I got very fascinated with it right after writing Neurobiology of the Gods, and the more I learned about it, the more it drew me in, and the scholarship of it is its own interesting story too. But we'll start with the basics. And number one, it was written in Old English back in around the 9th century. There's a lot of debate about exactly when, somewhere around that time. And this is important because during that time was a big transition point in history and religion and Europe. And the Beowulf poet, whoever he or she is or was, seems to have been, according to the scholars anyway, seems to have been pretty well versed in a number of different traditions. He was obviously, I say he, but we don't really know if it was male or female. Whoever it was obviously well versed in the poetic traditions. He uses and employs these poetic verses and meters that were common in Old English poetry. So he's well engaged with that. But he tells a story that's really quite unique in the corpus of that time frame. And that suggests that whoever this person was not only knew the court, storytelling modes of the poet, but also had a knowledge of classical literature and just seemed to have a real keen appreciation for the things that got people that were interested in hearing about at that time, heroic stories and all that. But then he also threw in a bunch of stuff about God. And so there's this kind of Christian overlay, Christian gloss to it. But it's, I think it's mainly, we can get into that part of it, you know, if we want to, but the Christian overlay. But I mean, he talks about God, but he doesn't ever mention Christ at any point. Right. So that's not a whole lot of dogma in the story at all. A lot of things, and many scholars have brought in Christian interpretations of the poem, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I do think they might be bringing in more their own perspective than the perspective of the poet intended. Mainly because, well, we'll get into some of the specifics. It'll be more clear. It'll be more clear.
Right.
And I do think that he probably was a Christian, but he also understood the kind of pagan mindset of the day. And it's another thing too, is to not get overly black and white about this, because nowadays people talk about Christians and pagans as if, you know, they've never met each other. And at that time frame in history, there was quite a bit of syncretism. There was a lot of blending, and people who have been practicing paganistic beliefs for a long time, introduced to Christian ideas. Many times in cases like that throughout history, the people will just go, "Oh yeah, that's cool. Jesus, we'll throw him in there too. What the heck, you know?"
Right, right.
And so it was this big blend, and you know, a lot of what we end up with through the lens of history is a lot of hand wringing and carrying on by, you know, monks at the highest level who are fussing about, you know, dogmatic issues, and it's just the common people didn't care about that stuff.
Yeah.
You know, so,
Yeah.
but they didn't write anything down. So what we have is the writings of the monks who are commenting on this stuff.
Right, right.
And frequently they're complaining. You know, some of these manuscripts that we have now are them complaining about doing, you know, those people out, and you know, they're doing it all wrong. You know.
Right, right.
Kind of funny, but that's getting kind of off subject. But yeah, back to the kind of analysis of the poem. I think there's a ton of archetypal stuff in it that is still relevant today, because it's speaking to timeless human encounters and challenges.
Yeah. It's
done so in a way that is very vivid and full of muscle and lots of really expansive imagery and monsters and mighty warriors and that kind of thing. But if you look past that and you see what it's really trying to get at and represent, the reason for that mythic magnitude is that, and I approach this the same way I do a dream. If I see a dream that uses and employs mythic level imagery, like God mode, that means that we're talking about extremely powerful emotional forces acting in the psyche. And what's a great way to depict that? Superheroes, gods, warriors, you know, monsters. And the more fairy tale like and fantastical it is, the more primordial, you know, I hesitate to say primitive because it's almost derogatory, but you know what I mean? It's from that level, it's from that primordial level. And so you need to treat it appropriately. If a god shows up in a dream and says A, B, and C, it's a good idea to listen, because that god, whether there's gods out there or not, the psyche is using it and saying, this is the level you need to be of seriousness. You need to look at this. So,
well, it's without us having to dig too deep into why human beings tell stories in the first place, right? I don't think we necessarily have to go down that rabbit hole, but something that we've
deep rabbit hole.
yeah, right. I mean, one we've talked about extensively is just resonance and psychological resonance. And, you know, you've written a lot about this. You've spoken a lot about this. We've talked a lot about this. And coincidentally, we've also discussed for a while doing a video series on Beowulf and why it is resonant on so many levels. And, you know, for me, I came to it in high school. I came to it in my first AP English course. And it was, I remember, I think I told you this, I remember sitting there and I was looking around. I was just like, and it was after reading halfway through it. And I'm looking around at my classmates. I'm like, do you guys realize what this is? Like, it pulled me in on so many different levels. And I was so enthusiastic and remain enthusiastic about it. But I think you're right in saying that there is most definitely something there. And it's something that really just picks up on the human experience, very much so. But yeah,
I agree. It's got a lot of emotional punch to it, especially when you get into the language of it. And I'm not fluent in Old English, so I can't read it in the original, but there are certain poetic renditions of it that seem to capture. I've read many different translations of the poem, and when you do that, you start to get at what the poem must have originally said, because you can see these different ways that they try to frame it. And I can only imagine reading in the Old English, and I've heard people say that they do know Old English, that's the only way to go, because it's right. It was designed for that language, and so it's got the most punch to it. But the way the poet phrases things and talks about things, you know, you just read it and you're like, yeah, you know, it just gets to you. Know? It really speaks to that powerful, you know, warrior energy, which it is about a warrior. So, duh, right?
Right.
Well, it's about resonance. Oh, I didn't mean to cut you off, but I was just going to
Oh,
say
fine.
that the story of Beowulf and how we came to know about it in the modern age is actually kind of interesting in and of itself, because it kind of wallowed in obscurity for centuries.
Mm,
Written in the 9th century, but it wasn't until many centuries later, like antiquarians of the 17th and 18th century came across it and stuffed it in their libraries, and they sort of dismissed it as just a bunch of stuff about fairy tales and crazy monsters. And this was, during the Enlightenment period, right? So that's the kind of thing that makes sense that people would do, at least in the upper crust, right?
mm,
But scholars in the late 19th and early 20th century started to see that actually there seems like there's more to this than just a silly folktale about a
right.
monster slayer. There's a whole lot more going on here. And if you look at all of the scholars that have commented on it over the last 100 years, starting especially with Tolkien's famous Beowulf, the Monsters and the Critics essay, which is a great essay to read if you have any interest in this at all, because it's Tolkien, number one, the great, godfather of all epic fantasy. But you can see, if you read that essay, you can see why he wrote Lord of the Rings, because he had a reverence for that type of storytelling, and he was able to understand it on an emotional level.
Right.
In fact, one of his things that he said was, really have to be, I'm paraphrasing, but he said you have to be careful about dissecting and analyzing myths, because you can kill it as if it were a vivisection, which I think is a really interesting way of looking at it. If you dive too deeply into, you reduce it down to its parts too much, which is a great observation. But starting with that particular essay, which I think was one of his major scholarly contributions. Most of us, of course, know him from his fiction works. But that was his big splash in the academic world. It was relatively quiet otherwise. But since then, other scholars have taken up that and said, you know what, there's even more here than we didn't think of or realize. Just the layers of meaning and irony that are used, and the way that certain images are constructed is loaded with cool stuff.
Right.
So that was a long interruption. What were you going to say, if you remember?
I don't.
Right.
No, it's okay.
I get so excited about that.
No. It's no. Tolkien was a prime example. I mean, at one point, I've read him saying something along the lines of like, creativity, and I'm paraphrasing, creativity has to have some grounding in rationality. But the more that I've kind of investigated his through line, specifically when he's kind of investigating Beowulf and fantasy in general, I think what he was trying to get at was less of stories and fantasy have to be rational way, and more so they have to be emotionally resonant in a way. And I think that gets to the heart of what we're kind of discussing in this introduction, which is like something like Beowulf not only had emotional, instinctual, if you will, archetypal resonance, but the core of what made it what it is also found in other stories that have been kind of adapted and built upon by authors such as Tolkien, and so on and so forth. So yeah, it's had quite a journey since its inception, or when it was created to now. And we were discussing right before we started recording, why is it that it's still in the pipeline of conversation, and why is it still relevant to what we're going to be discussing, which is depth psychology?
It's a great question. And it cues into the concept of resonance that I've been working on over the years, that certain types of stories. So if I look across a culture at all the stories being told, because humans are just naturally storytelling creatures, there's going to be a zillion of them. There's all kinds of stories. Some of them are completely stupid, and some of them are completely random, and that's fine. But the ones that stick are the ones that resonate across time. So the litmus test for a particular work of narrative is really this does it survive across time?
Mm-hmm.
So a good example is Flash Gordon
Mm.
and say Batman. Okay, so Flash Gordon and Batman were both created around the same time, within 4 years of each other.
Mm.
And there's a new Batman movie coming out this year. There's been countless Batman movies. There's been zillions of comics about Batman. Now, nothing against Flash Gordon, but it doesn't seem to have stuck like Batman has. There's something about Batman and his whole story and the rogues gallery of weirdos that he fights and all of that kind of stuff. And we can talk about Batman later,
Right.
another video, right? We definitely can do that. But there's a lot of resonant elements to it, meaning that they cue into universal emotional responses.
Right.
Those are the things that are going to last over time. So that means that if we're still talking about a story 800 or 900 years or 1,000 years later, or even more, there's got to be something really resonant about it,
Mm-hmm.
or else it would have been forgotten. It would have been, it's natural selection, right? It would have gone extinct. So a story like Beowulf or Batman, maybe in a few hundred years, also goes through this process too. Now we have a unique opportunity because Beowulf is an original manuscript, but that doesn't matter. Look at Arthurian legends. There's no definitive manuscript of King Arthur and all of that stuff. And yet we are continually retelling that story of Arthur and the knights and the Holy Grail and Excalibur and all that stuff. It's because there's resonant elements over it. And over a certain number of years, people, when they start to cue into the story, they would add pieces and bits and parts to it. So the telling and the retelling basically is a distillation process.
Right.
Once it's been told umpteen times, what you get is a concentrated piece of narrative that will grab you and it won't let it go.
Mm-hmm.
So this is where your myths come from, because that's a process over probably thousands of years. And these, and those stories, they won't go away at all. And now, people think, well, that's all just, in the past. Don't be fooled by the technological advances. What are they still doing? We have all of this technology to create video games, and they're all centered around hero's journey narratives and mythic themes and all that stuff. Same old stuff, different medium. Now, that said, Hollywood has yet to make a decent Beowulf movie. The best rendition of Beowulf is The Lord of the Rings. Right. Even though it's not having anything to do with Beowulf in it, it's just the themes are there. So that's how it survived. So I'm calling you guys out, Hollywood, anybody out there, because the ones they've produced so far suck. They're so bad, but let's not get into that.
Well, then let's dig into it then, because I agree. I would definitely agree that the majority of the renditions out there, actually pretty much all of them, are just not, they don't live up to what the depths, right, of the poem, of the work. And you brought up something in terms of, you brought up Batman and all that. I think the recurring themes that you see in these stories, the recurring things, especially with comic books, and comic books maybe we leave to another discussion, because I very much think, unlike Beowulf, they are this kind of hero's journey soap opera, so to speak, right? They're just kind of like, yes, these peaks and valleys of just the same story happening over and over again, but it grafts on and it grasps new generations that kind of read it, right? Where Beowulf is kind of this archetypal one, right? It's all that is packed into one actual story, and it doesn't, in my opinion, doesn't need to continue, because all that's very resonant there is there. So
and that's true. Now, and that's another piece, is if we were to talk about how popular narratives change over time. There's been a couple of death of Batman and death of Superman stories, and then that's like, oh yay, and then they go right back to it and keep going. And that's not unusual. But there are some reasons why I think that Beowulf is so concentrated with this stuff, and I think it has to do with the poet. We don't know everything about the guy, obviously we know very little, but what we can infer from the techniques he used and all that kind of stuff. And I think in combination with the time frame that he lived, which is a transition from a primarily pagan lifestyle to a more continental and Christian outlook, he was right in the middle of that when he was writing. And he seemed to know it, because everything that's in the story, if he mentions gods or religion or any of that stuff, you can read it two different ways. He may say God, but a lot of times he says like the Lord of all, or the great master, and that kind of stuff. And okay, that could be God, from the Christian point of view, or it could be Woden. It could be the chieftain of the Germanic tribes, the Anglo-Saxons. They all, of course, would be well known. Those names would be well known.
Mm-hmm.
And he frames it just so that you could hear what you wanted to hear with it. I think it was deliberately done that way.
Yeah.
So, but in so doing, though, he cues into the archetypal. He goes right past the cultural overlay that the archetypal elements get, piled on,
right,
and goes right to the heart.
Mm-hmm.
In so doing, now it may have been a political choice on his part, or it may have been, I want everybody to like this story, so I'll write it in such a way that it's got mass appeal.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing new under the sun, right? That's what they do today. They still do that. But it doesn't matter, because the end result was, bam, gets you right there. So wherever you're coming at it from, you can do the rest of the work.
Right. Well,
but if you do come at it from this dogmatic point of view, right? If you think, oh, it's got to be Christian because he was, then there's a lot of stuff about the poem that makes absolutely no sense. Like Beowulf going to heaven. He was a pagan. He was supposed to burn in hell.
Right.
That's the thing, right? That's what you're supposed to do. Same thing for a lot of the other glorified heroes in the poem.
Right.
And yet, even though he goes on a rant early on about the pagan ways and now they're all supposed to burn in hell and all that kind of thing, it comes across as lip service, mm-hmm. honestly. So, that's why I think one of the reasons why it works so well.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned it being this transitory time, right? And it was. And I think the kind of the polytheists at the time were probably a lot more likely to just be accepting of this kind of Christian God than the people that were the kind of proponents of spreading the word were of the actual polytheists that they were trying to get in.
And that's a pattern you see. I talk a little bit about this in Healing Symbols, but it's a pattern of religious expression that you see repeated over and over again, where the priestly class of a society, who, you have to have an agricultural base to support a priestly class. Mm-hmm. Which means then they're now specialists in religion. Those are the ones that get all hung up on dogma and everything else. Yeah. And the regular Joes out there in the farmlands and the hunting and all that, they don't care.
Yeah,
they don't care. And you see this in the Aztecs, and you see this in the northern spread of Christianity across previous, pagan Europe, where the high levels, and of course, those are the ones that write stuff. So we know a lot about them. But it gives you a skewed view of history. And when you look deeper into the archaeology, you can see that, okay, Jesus too, what the hell, right? You see this in India, right? This is massive syncretistic effect over long time frames, where they just absorb, everything that comes your way and just throw it in. Yeah, throw them in there too. What the heck?
Right.
So, I'm not too terribly convinced by these, arguments that it has to be this way.
I know. Yeah.
Okay, maybe the priests thought that, or the monks, but
yeah,
the regular people, not so much. And for our purposes, we're more interested in that, mm-hmm. rather than making, getting tangled up in the fineries of dogma.
I agree 100%.
Yeah, we don't care about that. We're psychology.
I know. Well, shall we start with the initial? Well, we just to kind of describe what we're going to be doing here to everybody. Pretty much, this is going to be part one. We've discussed a little bit of the introduction and the history of it, but where we're coming from with it, and then part two and potentially part three. Get into more of the finer details of the poem and the resonance there, but maybe let's kind of dig into how we've broken this up. Well, you've already done this in your book, but how we've broken this up, and you've broken this up into the psyche, right? As this story is a representative of the psyche as a whole. So where would you start with that?
Start with the beginning.
Okay.
So at the very beginning of the poem, the poet introduces us to a prototype of the entire poem in miniature with the story of Schildschiefing. Schildschiefing it's a classic hero's journey type of thing. He shows that he's a foundling, he's got nothing, and yet he rises up to be this greatest, one of the greatest kings of all time. And he talks about how he went far and wide and he conquered all the lands and all that sort of thing and ascended to greatness. And then ends in this brief discussion about Schildschiefing with "that was a good king," right? And I love the way the poem does that. It just says, "and this is so," and that's that, and I just love that. That's one of the great things about the poem, is that it just lays it out and says, "Here it is."
Right.
And there's no, even though there's tons of subtlety and layers in it, there's also times when it's just at face value. And so you get this really interesting interplay between complexity, and he gives complexity to many of his characters, whereas most stories of this time frame did not do that. He even dives into a little bit of the psychology of Grendel's mother, which would have been unheard of. She's just an evil monster and she needs to be killed, and that's that, for most lesser poets, but not him, right? But then at the same time, when he comes across something that is just so, and that's that, he just displays it for everyone to see and says, "This is good, this is bad, there it is." And so there's a lot of the power of the poem comes from that kind of stuff, because I think, especially to the modern mind, because we are so enmeshed and in this quagmire of information overload, where everything could possibly be anything. It's very refreshing to come across this, and you then kind of realize why stories like this were made. And I have to qualify this a little bit, but they were made as expressions of cultural value. So this was a good king. When he says that, and he says about Beowulf like 104 times, then it's like everyone listening to it can go, yes, we can agree on that, So it helps to foster a shared sense of value. So it's very appropriate that he begins with this story, because he's going to tell us about another king who comes from out of nowhere, who rises up to greatness and then dies heroically, namely our guy, Beowulf. So, but before he gets into that, he's like, "And let me tell you what a great king does, this. And now we're going to tell you this new guy here," right? And we're not sure, historians and scholars are not sure if Beowulf ever existed, or if he was a completely fictional character. And some argue that he was just a new fictional character. So he had his work set up for him, because that would have been unusual. So this is part of that work, is saying, here's another guy. He does the same kind of stuff. He must be a good king too.
Right.
Only I'm going to tell you a whole lot more about his life. So now, some would look at that and say, well, yeah, that's the point of fairy tales. I've read stuff like this, that they're just cultural scripts that impose moral value systems on children. Have you heard interpretations like this?
Oh,
yeah,
all the time.
Yeah, it just makes me want to roll my eyes, because it's a vast oversimplification. It helps to solidify a value system through storytelling, but the values of the stories, they're not necessarily just something somebody made up,
right,
to indoctrinate children. And of course, we talk a lot about how the psyche knows it has a moral compass already in it. Most people do. And so we don't really need that. Because the implication is that if we didn't have that, then we'd have no value system whatsoever, which doesn't make any sense. Rather, I think what these cultural narratives do is they modify the already existing moral directions in a person. And that's extremely important, but that doesn't mean that the narratives create those emotions. The emotions are already there to be sculpted by culture. So it's a fine point, maybe not all that important here, but I needed to say it. So, so then he talks about how Grendel. Well, before that, he goes into the lineage then from Shilbshifing, this great warrior king from the past. And now remember, this is a poem that is written mostly to speak to people who were illiterate. So we're talking about a mostly oral tradition.
Mhm.
Now, in an oral tradition society, 300 years might as well be 3,000 years because there's nothing written down. So what the stories you are told by the elders, that's time immemorial.
Right.
Know, 3 or 4 generations is infinity. That's not to say these people were ignorant or anything. They weren't. It's just that that's the power that you have to work with.
Mm.
Now, it doesn't have this tremendous power to preserve like the written word does. On the other hand, it's a heck of a lot more flexible than the written word is, because now, I mean, in a society like that, you don't have people going, but the Bible says X, right? That was written 2,000 years ago. There's none of that. There's none of that. This is what we're at now, and this is our current narrative. And so it will get updated with each new generation, and that's how it has worked since forever until writing was invented. But here we're in a transitional world. Writing is a new thing in this society, the Anglo-Saxon society. There was some writing, but it wasn't very widespread. There was runes that were used, but that was not the same thing as writing big, thick manuscripts. Nobody did that in runes. They would write them on objects and inscribe them on things. So anyway, you go 3-4 generations back from Hrothgar to Shilbshifing, and that the importance of that is connecting the lineage. Very important.
Mm.
In a society like this, in any society really, to establish your identity, that's a huge amount of what Beowulf is about, is identity. We'll be coming back to this many times.
Oh yeah, yep.
And it's so important in modern society because so many people don't know how to construct their identity in the information overload.
Right.
So I think that was one of the things that cued me to it when I first started reading it. It's because the ancients knew how to do this very well, and it's because they had to. They had lived in a world where your identity equaled life or death.
Mm-hmm.
So you better bloody well know it.
Right.
We live in a world where it is still life or death, but not from outside, from within. That's a whole other conversation. But in this case, we've got the poet connects Hrothgar to the ancient king, and therefore bringing him glory,
Mm-hmm.
through that, because he wants to establish that he's beleaguered by Grendel, but he's not a bad guy. He was a mighty warrior and all this kind of thing. So he brings him in. He says, and here we have Hrothgar. He's an honorable king. He's great and wonderful. He's powerful, but he's got this big problem. He's got this big monster who comes in there and tears up his whole house. So up to this point now, what are your thoughts? I want to get your reflections here.
So I think the part that really called out to me was what you were just describing, which is the kind of identity and the ancestral identity, and how it's very much it was very much a priority for those that were living while this kind of was verbally going from generation to generation, which is there's a continuation there, right? There's these were those that survived before you, and this is you now, and this is it's your task to survive. It's your task to live up to that name. And I think that can be a very powerful, not only idea, but visceral and emotional experience for some people. And I think that without getting into the kind of cultural ailments as of today in modernity too much, I think that having that foundation can be really stabilizing for a lot of people, especially those that live that, when this came about. So that's one thing. The second thing was, as I reread Beowulf, and then I actually, reading your book, coming at it from a very psychological perspective, but it's maybe I shouldn't say psychological, a instinctually resonant perspective. There were certain wavelengths that I was picking up on in terms of how this was set up, specifically with Grendel, and then specifically with Hrothgar at the beginning. Hrothgar being the new kind of rendition of the ego, right? The most up until Beowulf Arise, potentially the most updated version, right? So not only do you have that stabilizing self-identity through the past, but then you're brought into the present ego, which is Hrothgar, and then Grendel shows up. And I think you bring up a good point about he wasn't a bad king, right? It wasn't like he deserved something like this. And I think psychologically that is very relevant in terms of Grendel being representative of something that no matter who you are, right, you might have to potentially deal with. So yes. Yeah.
Well, there's absolutely, and you're really cueing into it. The drama between Hrothgar and Grendel and Beowulf is a way to depict a very common, widespread, if not universal, internal, frequently encountered conflict.
Yeah.
So the poet establishes the tribal identity and says, here's Hrothgar, he's built up this great king, he's the king of the Danes.
Yeah.
He then represents the ego at present. And everything is going great until Grendel shows up 12 years ago. So 12 years ago, by the time the poem, in that frame. Now the poet does some really interesting things with time, but we'll get into that later. But because as soon as he introduces how great and wonderful they are, and even later on in the poem, after Beowulf defeats Grendel and his mother, and they're celebrating, he immediately adds into how the fact that the whole place is going to burn down shortly.
Right.
So it's like, whoa, way to piss on the parade, right? He does it, right? And there's a reason. Yeah, there is a reason for that, but we'll get to that later. But yeah, so he's the established ego. And now, do you remember what it is that triggers Grendel's attacks?
Herod, the hall, the libations, the celebrations.
Exactly. Yeah. So the hall becomes a very important symbol in the poem. And there's a lot of things you can do with this poem in the same way that I would approach dreams. Number one being, why is it depicted this way and not some other way? There's many different ways that you could approach this idea that Grendel's attacking the Danes. The poet chooses the fact that the hall itself is what is attacked. Grendel doesn't attack the people if they don't go into the hall. Isn't that interesting? I mean, if he's just pure evil, that doesn't make any sense. He would just go out to wherever they are and kill them. No, it's the hall. So what do you think's up with that?
I think, well, okay, so if Hrothgar's the ego, right, and the hall represents this I would say very social part of ego experience, right? I mean, the ego is meant to be adaptive in the external environment and interact.
Yes,
then the hall is very,
and be the ruling principle of that conscious space,
right?
Social space, even more specifically.
So Grendel at that point, I mean, for me, and this is how I was conceptualizing, which was there is some level of a disconnect between the ego and its actions, right, through the hall, and then something, i.e. Grendel, who appears at night, right, when it's dark.
All the creatures appear only at night.
Right. And it's somewhat of well, most definitely a neurosis, I would say, for Hrothgar. If Hrothgar is the ego, there's some level of neurosis there. And secondly, Grendel is and can be this something coming from the unconscious that is very, very, I mentioned it in the notes that I sent you, catabolic in a way, right? There's this association there and attacking that which is the most social. I mean, if the ego was wanting to be social and wanting to celebrate and wanting to interact and all that, then this is something that is very catabolic, but depressive. There's something in that character of Grendel, right, that is very indicative of if this was a psyche, where the psyche is going and how it's interacting. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, it was 12 years of having to deal with this, right? Yeah.
Long time where Grendel is marauding the hall.
Yeah.
And if the warriors gathered under Hrothgar in the hall, he would attack at night and kill them all, grab them up and gobble them up, run off. So there's some really interesting stuff about Grendel in his lineage.
Yeah.
Too. that give us a clue as to what kind of a creature he is and what kind of thing that he represents psychologically. In the book, I talk a lot about him being a shadow element, a negative shadow element, but that we can actually do better than that. And I think you'd mentioned in your notes that he's more of a destructive complex. Now, you can still connect that to the shadow.
Oh, definitely.
Easily. But the thing is that the term shadow, the way that Jung defined it, is very broad. So there's all kinds of stuff that can come that are shadow elements, but they're not all the same. They have different flavors to them. So what kind of critter Grendel is the poet tells us this by telling us where he comes from. That's his identity, because origin is identity, right? We just started with that. So it applies to everything else in here. And his identity is from the line of Cain, right? So Cain, what's Cain's big problem? What happened to him? So whatever his pain is going to be Grendel's pain, right?
He's a kinslayer.
He's a kinslayer, yes. But what led to him being a kinslayer? This is what's so interesting about this.
Well, it's so that
rejected by God.
Yeah.
He felt rejected by God anyway. So there's a lot, and the poet uses the biblical imagery to tell a more heathen story, and it works. It works really well. Although he does lump elves in with all of the other nasty creatures, which even Tolkien said he didn't really quite buy that. But the poet was just trying to lump all of this, otherworldly creatures together as all within the line of Cain. That was probably due to contractual obligation to dogmatic, matters. But that's funny enough where the word orc comes from.
Right.
Orc just meaning living dead.
Really?
Yeah, that's what it translates to. Is basically a zombie.
Jesus. Okay.
Yeah.
That's all right.
It does teach you something about orcs, right?
Yeah.
Now we know a little bit more about orcs. They're as if they're living dead, So anyway, so Grendel coming from that background, so it comes from a place of rejection. It's like the rejection, the feeling of being rejected or disconnected from the self or God or the divine or whatever. The poet is arguing that can lead to a Grendel, a destructive force within the psyche that lashes out externally and within to those who are connected. Makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
It's a rage response. I'm angered that I feel like I'm rejected. I'm left out of the festivities. Jealousy. Now, that doesn't justify his behavior. He goes in there and gobbles them up, right? He could have just walked up and knocked on the door and say, hey, man, can I have a pint? But no, he doesn't do that. He's full of wrath and rage, and that's what makes him an evil creature.
Right.
But it is interesting, though, that the poet gives us a little bit of a clue that he's not just pure evil for the heck of it, for the lulz, right? There's a psychological connection there.
Yeah.
A chain of reasoning and events. If he had not felt, or if God had not rejected him, this is the God of the Old Testament who behaves very in a human manner. If God hadn't done that, would there have been a Grendel? Maybe not.
Right.
That now Jung gets into some of that stuff in Answer to Job, but we don't need to go down that road. So that's where he's coming from, and hence his mother too is also tied to that whole business. So there's different scholars divide Beowulf into 3 parts, and some of them divide it into 2 parts. You can make an argument for either one, because the first 2 monsters are connected to each other in a lot of different important ways, but the dragon's not connected to the first 2. But the interlude with the dragon, with Grendel's mother, it does have a lot of its own separate issues and concepts, and so that division makes sense too.
Yeah.
But anyway, so Grendel comes in, he gobbles up. What does he do ultimately with his actions? He prevents feasting in the hall, and he prevents the camaraderie of the warriors and the ladies of the hall, and none of that is allowed now. So then, if you were to argue that what is the symbolism of this poem saying, it's saying that feeling of rejection can grow into this and fester into this monstrosity that destroys your ability to connect with other people and to share in the common, being
Yeah.
all.
It's almost as if Hrothgar is the ego, right? I mean, and it's almost as if this kind of I would say projection or even a transference in terms of new experiences just being this veiled with this association, which is Grendel. I mean, the 12 years of Grendel is really this kind of depression, but
Yeah.
it's caused by a complex that is very much it's not I don't think it's a coincidence that he consumes the warriors of the hall, right?
Not at all. Not at all.
Because it's almost like there's some jealousy there, right? Maybe on Hrothgar's part. And I know it's not explicitly said in the poem, but I think Beowulf, being the character that he is, and what he does is something that is definitely indicative of something that Hrothgar was unable to do, right? And revivifying that kingdom. And the other thing with Grendel being, this lineage of Cain, this kinslayer, I think he's also described in the poem as the wrath of God, right? So he's simultaneously destabilizing in terms of the self-identity. It's like cutting away the lineage, right? In fact, his lineage is literally cutting away lineage, right?
Yeah.
Which you discuss in your book quite extensively, how that is it's very much a scar and something not to be wanted in the culture of the times. Then is like, if you kill one of your kin, that's the greatest sin, right?
That's the worst of all.
So Grendel,
the poem has a lot to say about that whole kinslaying business, especially later on when we get to what happens at the end of the poem. But
right.
And of course, the poet mentions the kinslaying again, even after Beowulf defeats Grendel and his mother. And the kinslaying still winds up destroying the hall anyway. So, in some ways you're kind of like, well, then what was the point of all that?
Right.
If you don't think about it, if you think about it, you'll have that thought, but then it doesn't matter because it's in the moment,
Yeah.
But oh yes, that's so true. And the poem is very much in more pagan moral set, in the sense that it does not concern itself with things like original sin or redemption and being saved by Christ or any of that stuff. As not a whit of it is in there.
No.
But there's a lot of stuff in there about thou shalt not kill thy kin. And because that is a rule that would have evolved in any context where there's a lot of tribal warfare. And again, that harkens also back to the idea of tribal identity and how it's super important in a pastoral warrior culture like, that time period.
Right.
If you meet some random person out there, they want to know instantly, oh, who the heck are you? What tribe are you? Do I need to kill you? Am I feuding with you? Are you stealing my cows? Stuff like that, And so it's really important to be able to say, I am so-and-so, son of so-and-so of this tribe. And then they can assess your worth at that point and decide whether or not they need to attack you.
Right.
Well, we live in a world like that now. So it's very easy to miss that stuff.
Yeah.
And I think because there are some consequences of that too, because the tribal identity thing is way older than the way we do things now. And I think it may have embedded itself in the genome for us to worry about and be very concerned about what tribe we belong to. And I think that was another thing that really jumped out at me about the poem, is that it's everywhere in the poem. And it's typical for poems of that time period to be concerned with that kind of thing, but they don't really hammer it as much as they do in Beowulf. Nevertheless, here's a story that's all internal dynamics. All the problems are going on within the tribe and of the Danes. And the damage and the mayhem that Grendel is causing our origin is ultimately in kinslaying. And that's the thing that plagues them.
Yeah.
And he, though, then kind of becomes the personification of that force.
Right.
This would have been a very powerful theme for ancient audiences, because there was a lot of kinslaying, and it was seen as a universal evil. You just don't do that, right? Even my enemies, if they start slaying each other, if I end up taking them over, I'm going to find the guys that did the most of that and take them out, because
Right.
like you just can't have that, right? That's dishonorable. We don't do that.
Right.
No.
And then the kind of the metaphor of Grendel and his interaction with the celebrations within the hall. I mean, how would it be beneficial for Hrothgar to be this king of this land and not be able to associate with the warriors of his land, right? And there's a certain amount like of distrust there and jealousy, right, through Grendel. But also if we look at it in terms of those warriors potentially being healing factors for the ego, right, to further adapt, and Grendel being this monster of complex, he's just devouring them nonstop and for years. So there's just so much there, and it really is, when you look at it from that perspective, in terms of how long ago this was written, and again, we're still talking about it today.
Yeah.
There's a true moral to it all, I would say, in terms of its psychological resonance.
Yeah, and if you just look at the imagery of the poem too for a second, you have the hall and you have all the surrounding houses that the warriors stay in because they can't stay in the hall.
Right.
Grendel then becomes a force of fractionation.
Yep.
And disintegration. And Hrothgar is therefore disconnected from his native soil, from the ground of which he is supposed to be the ruling principle. So he's crippled by this effect. If we look at the psyche and its structure and how it can dissociate and fractionate, and the road to healing is the road to integration, where we need to bring these pieces back together, you can see that is mirrored by the imagery of the poem. Once Beowulf defeats Grendel, they can have joy in the hall again, and camaraderie and all that kind of stuff, building those bonds that are so important in a tribal society. You can't do that with Grendel around.
No.
If it wasn't just a pure monster, they would have been taken over by some other tribe at this point. But they're like, I'm not going in there. Grendel's in there,
Right.
So that's a convenient way to keep that from being a plot element, which wasn't of concern to the poem, to the poet. He wasn't worried about that. He was more interested in what's the internal conflict going on here and how does it get resolved. Now, all of us can experience this, a complex coming in, rooted in resentments or jealousy or feelings of rejection, right? These are extremely painful feelings, and they can result in kinslaying. But evolution has wired us to be repulsed by that idea, even when it happens, right? So the irony, I guess, about all this is that, the rage and all that kind of stuff is pre-social. That's like a deeper level, attack, defend, that kind of stuff. So you see that in all kinds of animals. But we're not just any animal, we're a very social animal. So there's a whole lot of stuff that is built into the genome that says, yeah, you've got rage and you've got fear and you've got that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
You're gonna find mates and eat food. But you got this whole other set of mechanisms that says you also need to work together as a team and love each other. And those two don't always talk to each other. Those two layers don't talk to each other sometimes. And you can feel the pain of separation or rejection as if it were an attack on your life. And it's why, do you want to know why? Because it is. If you get kicked out, you're toast.
Right.
You get on your own, right? Another tribe will come by and just take you out, or you'll get, captured, or who knows what. So that can be death. So the one thing that the genome did say is we better connect that to rage and our natural defense mechanisms that are already there. So nature always works on whatever's there, for better or for worse. It'll just, okay, we better hook that into that, so that rejection can lead to the rage naturally, just written into the fiber of the cosmos, deal with it. And this is where it leads to, though, if it runs amok and it's not handled somehow. So this is why this could happen to anybody internally. So I see Grendels all the time.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
All the time. I've dealt with them myself. I've tried to deal with them the best I can. They can show up at any time, right? Unlike the poem, it's dealt with finally, and that's that.
Well, it's a I've experienced this myself, and it's this a complex that very much wants to kind of separate you from not only external relating and socialization, which you crave for, which you want to kind of be a member, right, of this golden hall, but it is absolutely devouring in that it not only separates you, but it keeps you in place. It keeps you there. I mean, and it can do it for years. And it's catabolic in nature, because not only you continually further distancing yourself with the external interaction, but whatever is at the core of it can also be potentially distancing you from a core foundational aspect of, for at the very least, the people that were living during the times that this was, spoken, your self-concept, right? Your lineage, your heritage. So it's twofold. It's really this it's attacking on multiple levels. And when that happens, right, and you said it earlier, this was not it is not a story of I would say a Christ-like figure coming to save the ego, right? This is a story of something much more powerful, I would argue, which is the psyche kind of reintroducing or introducing something that is equally as powerful as this complex, as this Grendel, which is Beowulf.
This is Beowulf, yeah, it's a counter complex. So the reason for looking at the poem is in two parts. There's a good reason to look at that from a psychological point of view, because in the first half, you're dealing with Hrothgar as the center of the ego, and Beowulf is an external healing force that comes in, sent from outside. But then when we shift over to the second half of the poem, Beowulf is the center, and we learn what he has to deal with in the dragon, which is an encounter with the self and with death and with eternity. So at this stage in the poem, though, Beowulf is not the representative of the ego. He's a representative of an external force that comes in to try to heal the ego. And this, if you're in the state where you're beleaguered the way Hrothgar is, where your sense of connection and ability to commune with your band of brothers and so forth and family is damaged, then you have to have something come in to deal with that. As 12 years is the poet's way of saying Hrothgar couldn't figure out how to deal with this.
Yeah.
And he tried as best he could, but the weapons couldn't hurt Grendel. All of our tricks and all of our weapons and none of that stuff worked. So in comes Beowulf. Now, the way that they introduce Beowulf is very interesting. And some of it is, it would be easy to look at the way that he comes into Heorot, the hall, as just being an indication of military ceremony among the tribes. That would be a very superficial way of looking at it. And yes, that is true, that it is reflective of the way that they do. But why would they deal with each other that way? That's what I'm interested in.
Yeah.
Why didn't Beowulf just come up and say, hey, I'm the new guy, I can take out this dude? They would have shooed him away. They would have said, get out of here. He had to earn his place to even talk to Hrothgar. Well, psychologically, that means that a new idea that's coming in to try to fix things is not going to be acceptable to the ego, the beleaguered ego.
Yeah. If
it just comes in, on a parade and saying, look, I'm the shiny new solution to your problem. Ha ha ha. It's just going to be like, who is this guy? Right? Get out of here. How dare you? Right? Walk into my house and tell me how to run my life. Right? That's what the resistance you're going to get. And there's a good reason for that resistance. It's because always, again, when you're trying to think about this stuff, you want to think, well, what if it wasn't there?
Yeah.
If you didn't have that, then any schmo could come in with some new stupid idea and you'd go right along with it, right? Because you don't have no resistance. So they don't know that Beowulf is the solution to their problem. They don't know this guy. So he's got to come in and convince them. So I look at this as a reflection of Beowulf, of course, as a character, just enjoying it for the narrative of it. But psychologically, there's a deeper lesson here, which is that the new idea that's coming in to fix the psychological issue you've got has to earn its keep. It has to be convincing. And the first way that he does it is through humility, which I think is really important. He comes in, he observes all the courtesies. He's challenged by multiple times. He's challenged 3 times.
Yeah.
Right. So you get the messenger out on the road. He said, who the heck is this bozo? Right. And then there's the guy at the door, which that scene is reflected in Lord of the Rings when they're approaching Theoden, you know, in his beleaguered state. He's the Hurrit, you know, that's the Hurrit of, and of course, the Rohirrim are based on Old English warriors. So it makes perfect sense. And then he's challenged by Unferth, and he gets through each time. And if you'll note also in there, he is a little bit less humble each time he goes in. Each time he's challenged. The first time he's challenged, he's very, very courteous. And he says, you know, I'm just here to offer my counsel, to offer my advice for a great king as yours, right? He's very flowery about this, and he lays it on thick because he's not an idiot. Right? Beowulf is intelligent. He's brutally strong, but he's not a moron, right? He doesn't just go in there and say Hulk smash.
Right.
That's unfortunately how he's often presented. They look at him and they just focus on his battle with Grendel and how strong he is and all that. And they, like in the movies too, they depict him as this idiot who's just screaming about how he's so great and strong and all this kind of stuff. And it's not, it's like, I don't know who this guy is. It's not Beowulf. So no, Beowulf doesn't do that. He comes up and he observes all the courtesies. So the messenger says, well, I can see how great and powerful you are just, you know, by hearing your words and all that kind of stuff. And of course, he lays out his lineage right before he says anything. So I'm Beowulf, you know, this is my father, I'm of the Geats, and, you know, what was it? He makes a connection to Hrothgar too that's really important. That's Hrothgar helped his father, Ecgtheow, and Beowulf says, therefore, I owe him a debt, right? I'm here to pay a debt. I'm not here to fix all your problems and tell you you're a schmuck because you can't get rid of Grendel.
Right.
No, not me. No, I'm here to pay my debt that is owed to mighty lords such as you know, Hrothgar. So that gets him in. And I see this in therapy. If I'm introducing a new idea, I got to be like Beowulf. I can't just go charging in there and say, well, your problem is you just need to quit worrying.
Yeah.
No, you know how well that works.
Yeah.
Oh, geez, why didn't I think of that? Get the hell out of my face, you bozo. Why am I paying you this? No, I gotta be smooth about it. I gotta say, look, I'm on your team. I'm on your side. You know, I think I might have something that might help. I don't know. Maybe we'll see. And expect the resistance. Expect pushback. Oh, who are you? What do you know?
Exactly.
Right.
Well, and something that we're very much cognizant of in hypnosis is that accept the resistance, right? Don't put up that wall. You have to be accepting of the resistance. And
respect it.
Right, exactly. Well, respect it, but understand it for what it is, and then really work with what presents, right?
Yes.
And with Beowulf is, he's a geek, but he's very culturally kind of resonant with where, you know, the Danes and the Geats. I mean, they're very much similar. It comes across the ocean, and it's almost like he's simultaneously a utilization of the self-healing principle, right? That what Jung might call like the transcendent function, right?
Yes,
the integration, but also something different, right? And but similar in that he's very much a revivification of the youthful representation of what this lineage and what this kind of pride in the culture, right? And the ancestors is, right? Yeah. It's almost like that he's returning that to Hrothgar.
Yes.
And I looked at every single one of those 3 challenges. If they were 3 challenges from the ego, they're almost like these neurotic alibis, right? Do we need this, right? Yeah. And Beowulf being simultaneously something very similar but potentially different.
But from beyond, from outside.
From beyond and outside. Yeah. It's a very just so well done in the poem.
Now I see you're getting it. Now you're getting it. The deeper you into it, the more you're like, damn, that's sophisticated.
Yeah,
that is really on point. This dude wrote this 1,200 years ago.
Right. Well, it goes to show, like, you don't have to necessarily choose to look at it. It's almost as if if you're looking to find Jung or depth in a work and kind of just implanting it onto that work, it's not necessarily going to work. But if you look at something from a lens of the potentiality for it being there, Beowulf is a prime example of something that is so resonant, right? Now, something I wanted to ask you about in terms of these three challenges is kind of digesting and getting into the character of Unferth, right? Because he is something that I always found his character just kind of, and you discuss it in your book, but I always found his character very interesting in terms of how resistant he is to Beowulf in comparison to the other two challenges.
Yes.
So
yes.
get into that.
Well, and it's in the symbolism, right? The resistance on the outermost layer, which is depicted by a literal position away from the hall, is the first guy that he runs into. And that's it's there. He does challenge. He goes, who are you on this boat from afar, right? Are you here to harm us or help? You know, it's just a part of the, the consciousness that says, what is that thing? What is it? How is it relevant to me? It's the feeling function. Very important. Then at the doorway, he gets a little more pushback, but that makes more sense because it's closer to his beloved king, right? So he's going to be a little more feisty about this. Like, okay, well, let's put the weapons down, right? That's what they do in Lord of the Rings. And then he gets into the hall, right? The guy, Unferth, is at his foot, is described a couple of times, right? So he's kind of like the right-hand man. And this guy's job appears to be to defend the ego from harm, from new ideas, from anything that comes up that might challenge his rightful place. So like you were talking about with hypnosis and accepting the resistance, like I'm not very versed in hypnosis, but I do see this in therapy in general, is that when I do encounter some new approach to things, I test the waters. I want to see how it might, is there resistance to that? And if there is, I don't get irritated. I don't get countertransference. I don't, all of that kind of stuff, right? I just recognize it for what it is. It's, it's there as an attempt at healing. It's an attempt to protect.
Yeah.
Even if the ego is stuck in a position that is a no-win situation, like Hrothgar is.
Yeah.
It's still worthy to try to defend it for further harm, right? So it's going to be there, and it's going to challenge anything that comes in there, including me, right? So that's just how it works. So in motivational interviewing, when you're dealing with people who have substance abuse problems, you deal with resistance, obviously, right? Because they don't want to give up using the drug. And if I get in there and I say, well, you just need to, I'm just going to, tell you to stop being that way, I'm not going to get anywhere. Not going to get in. I got to work with their goals. And I'm going to have to do just like Beowulf. I got to go in there and I say, I think I might be able to solve your problem. And if they say, well, what if I don't want you to? And I say, well, I'll tell you why you might want to, but I'll leave it up to you. And Hrothgar says, okay, I'll let you help me, So that's how you got to work with it. Right? You got to work with it. You got to get through that resistance and say, I am actually here to help. And that's really all I want. I'm not trying to tell you what to do or how to tell you how to run your hall.
Yeah.
Because you are king, and I will gladly tell you that. And that's what he's doing when he's paying respects to Hrothgar. He's talking about his great heroic deeds in the past. He's acknowledging his power and saying, I am not here to take that away. Yeah. I'm not here to try to take over or any of that stuff.
Right.
Which is translated into modern psychological terms is, I'm not trying to tell you what to do with your life. I'm not trying to foist my value system on you. It's not my job. Same kind of thing. It's just depicted in this very flowery, kind of really vivid way in the poem. Right. But it tracks completely all the way through. Yeah. That's what's so shocking about it. It's like many stories don't do it that tightly. They don't track it so closely, but this one does. And I think it's either the poet was just extremely intuitive and he must have had a fantastic feeling function and an intuition that he's able to track it in a way that felt right. Or maybe he was just, a psychological genius, who knows? But the passage with Unferth is fascinating because I've seen many misinterpretations of this passage. many people look at the past. Okay, so let me just describe it for the readers, the watchers, the listeners, whoever you are out there, for our vast, fans,
Yes.
all two of them.
Yes.
So yeah, so many of them will look at that passage. So the passage, he comes in and Unferth challenges him. He says, "Who is this guy? I knew this guy. I heard of him. He almost drowned, got himself drowned trying to beat his friend in a swimming contest, and he failed miserably. He's no use to us. He's not going to help us." So that, number one, connects your deeds to your value and your worth, right? This is a very common theme throughout this whole poem. Very important. We'll get to more of that down the road. But also, it's just straight up challenging. Who the heck do you think you are coming in here telling us this? And then Beowulf says, "Well, you've got your facts all wrong. You're just drunk. You don't know what happened, really. Your thoughts or your story is confused by much beer," or something like that.
Yeah,
he says,
right.
And he says, "I'll tell you what really happened. What really happened, I went out there on a youthful, exuberant challenge to each other. We weren't trying to beat each other. We were just out there testing our mettle. It's typical like young man kind of thing to do."
Yeah.
And we got separated we got hit with this big storm. We got separated. I got sucked down into the sea by sea monsters, and I fought them for 9 days, and they couldn't pierce my mail, and I slaughtered them all. And then I wound up in the land of the Finns, which in this time period would have been like the other world, or Niflheim, or the land of the giants. That's how the Anglo-Saxons viewed Finland, as like that. It was just this mysterious other world. So, and then I, came home victoriously. So, and also, and of course he ends it with the exclamation point. "And by the way, I've never heard anything you've done except kill your brothers," right? Kinslayer.
Yeah.
So that passage is really interesting because a lot of commentators have looked at this and said, look how arrogant and how boastful Beowulf is here, and how he responds with anger and rage. And this is a sign of him being immature and, toxic masculinity and all this kind of stuff. And I'll look at that and I'm like, that would make sense, except that's not really what happens, because after he basically calls Unferth out, if it had been done in rage or wrath, Hrothgar would have been incensed by this. He would have said, how dare you come in here and insult my right-hand man? He doesn't do that at all. He stands up and he cheers. Well, that doesn't make any sense.
Right.
Unless you understand what the function of that whole exchange really was. And the function was actually, and this is where you have to know the context, or else you impose modern value systems on it and you misinterpret it. This is a big mistake. And this applies to dreams too. You can misinterpret dreams by not having the whole context. And in this case here, you can look at it and go, okay, well, what was Unferth's role? He had the role of challenging people who came in as his right-hand man, so that Hrothgar didn't have to do that. Okay, so he performed an important role, which was kind of let's get into the nitty-gritty. I'm going to start calling you out and all this kind of stuff. That way, if it turns out that he's proven wrong like he is here, Hrothgar does not lose face. Very important. So Beowulf can tell him off, which in a way is kind of addressing Hrothgar, but not in a way that actually directly attacks him, so that he has no risk of losing face, because it's so important for him to be able to come in and try to help without Hrothgar losing face. That's very important in this society. And because of that, and because of the intense attention to your status and saving face and all the stuff that we tend to dismiss as just a bunch of, negative ways of thinking, we don't know what to do with feelings of pride in our culture in modern day compared to what those guys knew how to do. In that setting, they had to toe the line between being boastful and prideful and yet also humble, and not crossing that line. It was extremely important and very sharp line for them. And Beowulf rides it right down the middle, the golden path, right, keeps going up. And and the way he does it is by telling him off, but and we talked about Jordan Peterson before, and this subject came up, where I think at some point or another, Peterson was talking about conflict resolution and how in other settings, men would just go outside and beat each other up to decide who wins.
Right. We talked about this. Right.
Yeah. Remember we talked about this. And when I first heard that, I thought, no, that's not how that would work. Because that could easily lead to kinslaying if it got cut out of hand, And even if you look at actual Viking culture of this same time period, and the Anglo-Saxons were related to the Vikings through language and custom, they would sometimes carry out duels, but many of them didn't end in death. They would just go out there and smash each other's shields for a while, and they'd get tired and give up. And get it out of their system, But even in that case, what Beowulf represents is a way of that conflict resolution that has nothing to do with Beowulf and Unferth going outside and beating the stew out of each other.
Yeah,
it was a conflict resolution through words. It was an epic rap battle, is what it was.
Right.
That's something that was common in that time frame. Was these poems depicting battles, back and forth, trading insults.
Well, it's what is it called? Flighting, right? I feel like
flitting. That's what they call it.
Flitting. Yeah. I think it's a couple things with all of it. I think the capacity to actually go outside and kill each other was very much there. And I think given the fact that that was such an essential part of war, right? It was very warlike during that time, right? It wouldn't behoove the culture that was instituted for that to just continually be a part of everyday life. It was, but it's like, no, we got to figure out another way in order for us to really deal with these tense, aggressive situations, which you use the term or the phrase in your book. You say Beowulf unleashed his word horde. And I love that line, because I felt like it exemplifies just so much of what was a part of that culture at the time, which was using your words in a way to just not necessarily, you want to prop yourself up in pride and literally say, this is what my deeds are, right? Which was very important. And at the same time, challenge whatever's coming at you. So the tension there was an essential part of it all, but being able to express yourself thoroughly and in a very instituted manner.
I wish that I had invented that phrase, because that was the poem. The poet came up with that, and the point says, "I've been withholding up to this point, but now I'm going to unlock my word horde on."
Yeah, I love that. I love it.
I love that too, because it shows. Now, Beowulf is very much an idealization. It doesn't surprise me. It wouldn't surprise me if he never existed, because he's just so perfect in every way, right? And that kind of goes against modern, ideas of what stories should be about, people flawed and all that kind of thing. And this is just not about that. And this story is not really about that. It's about showing an ideal in fine detail, like in real, quote unquote, real world situations. There is some interesting stuff about Beowulf in the sense that even though he fights supernatural enemies, everything else surrounding it is very realistic for the time frame, even down to the descriptions of the war gear and all of that kind of stuff. So there was an unprecedented level of realism in the poem too, despite the fantastical elements, which it's almost as if happened in like a dream world. And then it goes right back to, okay, now we're back to the hall and the regular world of the, hero's hall and all that stuff. But that's another conversation. Yeah. But yeah, you're right. It's, and that's part of the process, is only unlock your word horde when it's exactly appropriate. The timing is critical. If he'd have done that first, it wouldn't have worked.
Right.
If he'd have withheld the whole time, it would not necessarily have worked. But I believe that Beowulf's basically trouncing Unferth verbally was a way of him to show his strength and his ability to handle himself, that the hall needed to see, that Hrothgar needed to be able to see that. And that's why Unferth was such an important part of his hall. It wasn't just some guy heckling from the shadows,
Right.
People describe him that way. It's kind of like the court jester. And I'm like, no, that's not really it. He's not a buffoon. When people come in, it's his job to challenge them, see what they're made of, right? I'm going to find whatever weak link in his armor, and I'm going to throw that at him and see what he does.
Mm-hmm.
That's his job.
Yeah.
And it's an honorable job. He needs to, and you're going to encounter Unferth when you're working with folks, or within, you might encounter that. A new idea comes in and you might just reject it out of hand. Yeah, it's baloney. I heard about that. That's crap. That's right. Unferth talking through you. We've all got one.
Well, and then the comparison that Beowulf makes, I mean, implicitly by suggesting that Unferth, the only thing he's known for is killing his brother or his family. Mm-hmm. And how that connects to Grendel, I think is very much intentional, because if the first two layers of the ego being these on the beach and then at the beginning of the hall, mm-hmm. Unferth being the closest to the ego, being this neurotic alibi, it's almost as if Beowulf being this counter complex, but simultaneously a part of what I would consider the alter ego, the unconscious. There's something coming through there, but also something external, right? Something different, right? So it's this counter complex that's being presented. When Hrothgar decides not to say, no, do away with you, and he actually cheers, he's excited. In that moment, Hrothgar is going from being identified, right, with the idea that Grendel, this is something that we're always going to live with. It's been 12 years. This is just the way it's going to be. To, no, this has been going on. It's still here, but there's something potentially here that could lead to our salvation.
Yeah.
And health, right? Yeah. And I think that's the moment when he sees that Beowulf can really compete, right? And really, and has the potential through his interaction with Unferth. Hrothgar is like, nope, okay, all right, we have, there's something here. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, and Beowulf demonstrates an extremely powerful principle of the narrative itself. And again, this is a thing that runs through the whole analysis of the poem. Is I found over and over and over again the power that narrative has, of storytelling that it has on affecting the mind, the emotions, everything.
Yeah.
Because Beowulf doesn't actually say that Unferth is wrong about the facts. There's nothing different about the facts. They went out into the water and they got separated by a storm. It's just that the interpretation is wildly different. On one hand, you've got Unferth's version of the story is that he was a total failure. Mm-hmm. So it's a what we call a reframe, I guess.
Right.
But that doesn't do it justice at all, in my opinion. It's more than just a reframe, which to me is kind of a weak phrase. I don't use it with patients because I'm restructuring the narrative. I think that's a much more powerful way of saying what I'm doing. I'm trying to do what Beowulf does here and says, you had a setback.
Yeah.
You got dragged down into the water, but you survived. And isn't that kind of badass?
Yeah. Right.
And so he uses it rather than as a way of bringing himself down and his own self-worth down, but to do the exact opposite. So the exact same event can have wildly different effect by restructuring the story, see? And Beowulf is a master of this.
Right.
And he demonstrates it in this exchange.
Right.
So you could look at this internally and say, I have two storytellers in my head, and one of them's Unferth and one of them's Beowulf, with respect to what has happened in my life and the failures that I feel like I've encountered. And you'll have one that says, yeah, you suck. And the other one that says, but wait a minute, hold on here.
Right.
Let's look at what really happened.
I think that's why the connection between Unferth and the complex being Grendel is there. It's almost as if Unferth is simultaneously looking at the situation with Grendel, potentially, and speaking this in terms of the psyche, looking at the situation as this is something that it's stable, right? The way we've been doing things is relatively stable. Right. Now, if we yeah, right. So even if you are living in kind of a maladaptive state, it's still stable in a way. It's not propagating new life. It's not propagating the ability to grow past it. And I think that's the really representative in Unferth, because all you're known for is that you've killed your brothers or your brother. You're a kinslayer, just like the the complex, the demon, the in the lineage of Cain. And I think that's
Unferth
really
doesn't deny it either.
right. Exactly. So Hrothgar being at that point able to disconnect from that association, from that is huge.
Yeah. And there's a reconciliation of sorts in the poem too, between those two.
Yeah.
Because Unferth, even later on, he's like, I still don't know about you. You know, I don't know about this solution when Grendel's mother comes along. But then in the end, he's like, okay, I see your worth.
Yeah. Right.
And that's very interesting, where now the points of opposition have now joined forces.
Yeah.
At the end there of that conflict.
Right.
He comes late to the party, but you know,
right.
he comes around.
Right. Wow. Good stuff so far. So shall we cut it there for now? I think that's
let's stop there, and
I think that's a good part one.
Monster, and then we'll start off with a bang.
Yeah. Well, I think maybe we start off part two with and maybe look forward to this to all our viewers, right? To everybody watching. We start off the reasons why Beowulf decides to fight Grendel the way he does. I think that's some pretty cool stuff. There's some cool stuff in that.
Yes, it is.
Yeah. All right. Well, Dr. Goodwin, it's always been a pleasure. Thank you for having me on your channel again.
Most appreciated.
Yeah. Yes, sir. All right. We'll see you later.
Okay. Bye-bye.